Right, let's jump straight into this explainer. Today we're taking a journey through what started as a localized crisis, but then rapidly, almost unbelievably, spiraled completely out of control. It engulfed the entire globe and literally birthed the modern world as we know it. Yep, we are talking about World War I.
But before we get into the how and the why, I want to start by anchoring us with one absolutely staggering number: 9.5 million. That is the number of dead soldiers this conflict left in its wake. When the powers of Europe first marched off to battle, the general expectation was, that this would be a short, glorious war, over by Christmas, right? Instead, as we're about to unpack, it morphed into this agonizing, industrialized slaughter with absolutely no end in sight.
So, here's our roadmap for today's explainer. We'll start with the spark and the stalemate, move into a brutal war of attrition, see how the tides turn in 1917, and finally look at the collapse and consequences.
Let's dive right into part 1, Spark and the Stalemate.
The whole thing really traces back to a single violent spark. On June 28, 1914, in Sarajevo, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, he was the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was assassinated by a 19-year-old Slav nationalist. And this single event immediately activated this rapid, fatal web of alliances. It's almost like a terrifying domino effect. Austro-Hungary blames Serbia, sends them this humiliating ultimatum. Serbia rejects it, so Austria-Hungary declares war. Then Russia mobilizes to defend its fellow Slav nation Serbia. Because Germany has an alliance with Austria-Hungary, they mobilize and declare war on Russia, and then France. Literally, in just a matter of weeks, the great powers essentially drag each other into a massive continent-wide conflict.
Now, Germany's initial strategy completely fell apart. They were relying on something called the Schlieffen Plan. The idea was to make a massive, rapid advance through neutral Belgium, quickly crush France, and then spin around to face Russia in the east. But the plan failed. In a desperate counterattack right outside Paris, famously aided by a whole fleet of Parisian taxicabs ferrying troops up to the front lines, which is just incredible to think about, the Allies halted the advance. And because they were forced to seek shelter from these deadly new machine guns and artillery, 6 million marching men were suddenly driven underground. They dug an astounding 350 miles of continuous trenches, stretching all the way from the English Channel down to Switzerland. The static, deadly stalemate of trench warfare had officially begun.
But this didn't just stay neatly contained in Europe. The conflict rapidly spilled out across the oceans and into far-flung colonies. Britain, who had the world's most powerful navy at the time, threw a strict blockade on Germany to just completely starve its economy. Meanwhile, Japan honored its treaty with Britain and actually seized the German naval base at Qingdao. And over in Africa, we see chaotic fighting breaking out in Togo, Cameroon, and East Africa, where a highly successful German guerrilla war ended up tying down huge numbers of Allied troops.
As the conflict broadened, the Ottoman Empire joined the Central Powers. And in 1915, as our sources detail, the Ottoman Empire began the systematic deportation and murder of ethnic Armenians living within its borders. Transported out into the Syrian desert and essentially left to die, over 1 million Armenians perished. The Allies explicitly condemned these events at the time as a crime against humanity and civilization. At the same time, the source material notes that, to this day, the Turkish government actually disputes the death toll and rejects that these events constituted a genocide.
Okay, moving on to part 2, a war of attrition.
By 1916, commanders on literally all sides realized a short, decisive victory was practically impossible. And this brings us to a really chilling concept: the war of attrition. German General Erich von Falkenhayn unleashed this strategy at the French fortress town of Verdun. And his stated goal? It wasn't even to capture the territory. He literally wanted to, in his words, bleed France white. The Battle of Verdun became this horrifying mincing machine, designed to grind down the enemy and inflict such enormous losses that an entire nation would just run out of manpower and be forced to surrender.
Faced with this terrifying strategy, the French mounted a desperate, entirely unyielding defense. French General Robert Nivelle famously promised, "Ils ne passeront pas," they shall not pass, and they held the line. They absolutely refused to yield that symbolic town to the German army.
So, what did it cost to actually uphold that promise? Well, the French suffered a devastating 365,000 casualties at Verdun. And the really horrific irony of attrition warfare? The Germans lost almost exactly as many men just trying to take it.
Fueling these absolutely massive death tolls were terrifying new industrialized weapons that were just being introduced to the battlefield. The Germans brought in lethal poison chlorine gas, which immediately forced a chemical weapons arms race. U-boats were attacking undetected beneath the ocean waves. Giant zeppelins were actually dropping bombs on civilians from the sky. The British debuted a brand new armored vehicle, and fun fact, they secretly shipped them in crates labeled tanks to disguise them as water reservoirs, which is exactly how they got their famous name. And up in the air, inventions like the interruptor gear allowed machine guns to fire straight through a spinning airplane propeller, which turned the skies into a brand new, incredibly deadly arena of war.
To truly grasp the devastating impact of these modern weapons going up against really outdated older tactics, just look at this number. During the British and French summer offensive at the Somme, a massive, long artillery bombardment completely failed to knock out the German defenses. So as waves of British infantry advanced out into no man's land, they were just mercilessly cut down by machine gun fire. In just a few hours, on the very first day of the battle, the British suffered 57,000 casualties.
But you know, behind the scenes, the war was also being fought with some intense secret political maneuvering. Down in the Middle East, Britain desperately wanted Arab support against the Ottoman Empire. So, they promised Arab leaders an independent state, which sparked the famous Arab Revolt. Yet, simultaneously, and here's the kicker, Britain and France secretly signed the Sykes-Picot Agreement. They were basically planning to carve up the Middle East into their own specific zones of control the minute the war ended.
Which brings us to part 3. Tides turn in 1917.
Now, 1917 brought a massive geopolitical shift, and this brilliantly illustrates how chaotic things got. On the Eastern Front, a major Allied power utterly collapses. Enormous casualties and severe bread shortages in Russia led to huge riots, the abdication of the Tsar, and ultimately the Bolshevik Revolution led by Lenin. He promptly signs a peace treaty and pulls Russia out of the war entirely. But just as Russia exits the stage, an industrial giant enters. The United States officially declares war on Germany, bringing immense, fresh resources to the deeply battered Allies.
Now, you might be wondering, why did the US finally abandon its strict neutrality? Well, it essentially came down to a series of fatal miscalculations by German leadership. Knowing they absolutely couldn't win a long, drawn-out war, Germany gambled on resuming unrestricted submarine warfare, essentially sinking neutral American ships to try and starve out Britain. Then, the British intercepted the incredibly infamous Zimmermann telegram. This was a message where Germany was actively encouraging Mexico to attack the United States. This intense pressure finally forced U.S. President Woodrow Wilson to declare war.
But before those immense American resources could fully arrive, the troops already stuck in the trenches were reaching their absolute breaking point. Years of senseless losses caused French army morale to just collapse entirely, resulting in massive mutinies where whole units simply refused to attack anymore. Meanwhile, the British launched an offensive at Passchendaele, where incredibly heavy rain and constant shelling turned the battlefield into this impossible, deadly sea of mud, and that alone cost them another 240,000 casualties. Now for our final section, Part 4. Collapse and Consequences.
Driven by just desperate exhaustion, German General Ludendorff planned one all-out last-ditch spring offensive. It was a massive gamble to try and win the war before America could really tip the scales. But the gamble failed. Despite making some early advances, the utterly exhausted German army was finally halted at the River Marne, and there they collided directly with nearly 1 million newly arrived, completely fresh American soldiers.
From there, the Central Powers rapidly disintegrated. August 1918 became known as the Black Day of the German Army, as Allied forces completely broke through their lines. By October, both the Ottoman and Austro-Hungarian empires had completely collapsed and were seeking peace. Finally, facing a massive mutiny at home and the abdication of the Kaiser, a German republic was proclaimed. And at exactly 11 a.m. on November 11, 1918, an armistice was signed. The trench warfare was finally over.
Following the armistice, the Paris Peace Conference drafted the Treaty of Versailles, and the resulting treaty imposed incredibly harsh, punitive terms on Germany. Their military was severely restricted in size, they were forced to pay unimaginably heavy war reparations, and they lost vast amounts of territory. Furthermore, they were forced to accept full, total responsibility for the conflict in what was called a war guilt clause. And as our sources impartially note, that specific condition became a source of lasting, deeply bitter resentment in Germany.
Let's pull back and see how this all builds into a catastrophic final human cost. We're looking at 9.5 million soldiers dead, 21 million more wounded, 7 million civilians killed. Huge, sweeping areas of Europe were left just utterly devastated. 4 vast,
ancient empires completely vanished from the map, and countless new states were hastily born from their ashes.
The boundaries of Europe and the Middle East were drastically redrawn by the victors. But as we reflect on everything we've covered in this explainer, we really have to recognize that these treaties didn't actually secure a lasting peace. They merely sowed the seeds of future conflict. So, I want to leave you with this to consider. Looking at the map of the modern world, which of these hastily redrawn borders is still directly impacting global events today? Thank you so much for learning with us, and keep questioning the history that shapes our present.